Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're streaming the reVision Symposium from the ancestral lands of the Kaurna people. And I thank you for joining us in this last session of the day today. I'm Debbie Pryor, the Artistic Program Manager and here at Guildhouse, and I'm excited to introduce the final speaker session today, Utopian Future, with Andy Butler, Jamie Lewis, Catherine Truman, and Joel Spring. This for artists and leaders will discuss genuine and critical change within the arts and cultural sector, celebrating the resourcefulness of artists and investigating how organisational models and individual arts practice is shifting during and post the pandemic. Jamie Lewis is an artist and CEO and Executive Director of NextWave. Her focus seeks alternative models of leadership, governance and structure. And under her directorship, NextWave have taken brave and necessary steps to remodel their mode of delivery away from the festival and onto new ground. Catherine Truman is an established visual artist and co-founder and co-director of Grey Street Workshop, established in 1985. In addition to her celebrated arts practice, Catherine is a leading thinker and mentor. Her commitment to the community and stewardship of arts development holds a critical role in the South Australian arts ecosystem. Joel Spring is an architecture graduate and a multidisciplinary artist, currently focusing on the contested narratives of Australia's urban culture and Indigenous history in the face of ongoing colonisation. He is a part of Future Method Studio, a collaborative practice working within architecture and installation. And Joel is currently the guest editor of Runway Magazine's edition 44, titled Time. Leading the session today is Andy Butler, a writer, curator and artist, in addition to the acting artistic director of Westbase. With an interest in investigating structures of power and the political, cultural and interpersonal legacies of Western history, Andy has a powerful voice within his writings for publications such as the Saturday Paper and the Monthly. Welcome to you all. I'll hand over to Andy. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for those introductions, Debbie. It's really great to be joined by such an incredible community of peers today. As Debbie mentioned, my name's Andy. I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I just want to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. The theme of the panel today is utopic futures, which, depending on where you spent lockdown, you might have different thoughts about what a utopic future may look like, and you might have, different levels of cynicism or excitement. I know that here in Melbourne and up in Sydney as well, where Joel is, I feel like that was, quite a different experience in the small art sector than maybe what has happened around the rest of the country. Perhaps in South Australia as well. So I'm really excited to be in conversation with Catherine Truman today as well, and all of you lovely people that have made the time to listen to us talk on a Saturday afternoon. I might begin by asking sort of everyone to give us a little bit more of an insight into what they do in the organisations that they work for, and then we'll sort of kick off the conversation a little bit. I was really taken with the sort of pre-discussions that we had that Jamie, Catherine, Joel and I all wear a lot of different hats, across being arts administrators, artists, human beings, but usually very busy people that are embedded within an arts community and really trying to support a lot of people. We have a lot of expertise in the room today. I think it was interesting that Jamie mentioned that NextWave started in 1985, the same year that Catherine's Grey Street project started. It's also the year that Jamie was born. So there's, a few different generations here, a lot of different perspectives, and I think it's going to be a really rich conversation and hopefully positive. We're trying to keep it positive while critical. But yeah, to kick it off, I'd really love to hear, a bit more of a deeper intro into what everybody does. And maybe we can start with you, Catherine, being our resident Adelaide representative.
Thanks very much, Andy. It's such a pleasure to be here. I've been attending this symposium all day, and I've been elevated by it. It's been so positive. It's really wonderful. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from Kaurna land, and it's unceded land, and I want to pay respect to elders past and present. Wow, I do wear a lot of hats in my life, and all really enjoyable. First one is a partner of Grey Street Workshop that indeed was established in 1985, and it still feels really vital and evolving today. So along those lines, I've worked with lots of different people, and it's been a wonderful experience. I always talk of the workshop as being my legs, so it's a great foundation from which I can work, and I always think that's really important. It also has opened up a lot of mentoring opportunities for me. So I have another hat as a mentor, and I've had fantastic opportunities and experiences working with people from cross-generational and a lot of different levels of experience too. I've learned a lot through those processes, and so I also think that that's another important role, particularly when we're talking about trying to envisage a utopian future. I'm not quite sure really ever what that word means, because everybody's view of utopia and dystopia are quite different. And I'm not sure actually, you know, I'm going to throw a real clanger in the works right from the beginning, whether beginning with that platform of trying to find what is perfect in the world or the best way of being is actually good for us. The pandemic is a case in point. It's really thrown us into some interesting challenges that have forced us to think quite differently about how we live and where we live and who we work with. The other thing that I need to mention is that I'm a research-based artist and have been for 42 years. And my interest has been working across disciplines. So I think, you know, my pathway to utopia has been being challenged by other people, by thinking about the knowledge that we carry, what we can share, and the knowledge that we don't have, all the things that we don't know, because that's a great catalyst for art making and for science making. So I work with a lot of scientists, biomedical science from the science area, and more recently plant scientists, because I'm very interested in that human-plant crossover. It gives me a great platform from which to work. The latest show that I've had was a result of 2 residencies. One was working in the ophthalmic department at Flinders University, and the other at the Botanic Gardens and the herbarium at the South Australian Botanic Gardens, looking at the role of light in vision and growth. So how the human eye works and how plants work and how they both photosynthesize. That was the basis of my project called Shared Reckonings. And it's called Shared Reckonings for a reason, because that subject matter was merely a hook for me to be able to work with a lot of different people from different disciplines. And of course, during that time, we were hit by incredible climate change extremes. So the bushfires that went through Australia, that was the beginning of my project. As I spent a year working with other people in residencies and universities and the herbarium, and also, so the next year was going to be spent making things in my studio in creative response, keeping those collaborative platforms in mind that I'd established the previous year. And the pandemic then hit as well. So it was absolutely fascinating working with people who do think quite broadly about where we live and how we live, using the body as a basis for that, but also other aspects of the living world and how they're affected. So, it's been a very rich and challenging couple of years, and I'm really interested to hear what other people have got to say about what their experience has been.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I feel like you've gotten us off to a really amazing start, because it's really interesting to hear about this project you did at the beginning of the bushfires of Black Summer. That seems like that was the beginning of this sort of extended series of crises. And it sounds like, yeah, I think we're at a point where we're all starting to really keenly understand the political, cultural, and economic context within which we work as cultural practitioners, which hopefully we can sort of unpack a little bit more amongst all the panelists today. Sort of going way to the other end of the intergenerational discussion today, it'd be great to hear from you, Joel Spring. Just a quick intro into sort of what you're doing at the moment. Especially sort of in relation to PARI, which is a new RE in Parramatta for those that don't know. So out of all the organisations that are represented here, Next Wave from 1985, Grey Street Workshop from 1985, West Base, it started in 1993. We also have Joel, who works with PARI, that was started 2 years ago, Joel? 3 years ago. Yeah, it'd be great to hear, just a brief intro into sort of what you do across, so many hats. Yeah.
Easy. Yeah. Yaman Demarang. I am streaming to you from Gadigal country, in a site that is University of Technology, Sydney. This is a place that I work and I do research from. Yeah, I'm a Wiradjuri artist and arts practitioner, I guess. Trained in architecture. I grew up and work in and around Redfern for a very long time. It's kind of where I got involved with, making work. I used to work in community broadcasting at Radio Skid Row, which is a radio station, community broadcaster here in Sydney, on a show called Survival Guide, which is about, gentrification in Aboriginal communities, but particularly in Redfern, sort of crucible of Aboriginal self-determination in Australia. And today, actually, I came by the train from PARI to here to stream to you. So I was we are having our third visioning session for what we're looking to do as a kind of relatively new, but hugely sort of spread and really incredible kind of PARI. I was invited to join on maybe 3 or 4 months ago. So really, I'm very new in relationship and just have always just been a massive fan. So it was such a humbling opportunity to be invited in to sort of think about what PARI could do in the future and what we could do better. So today I got to facilitate. I ran the beginning of our day, which was us sort of, talking through what are our collective trajectories and what are the things that we're looking to do. And we were really fortunate to have Uncle Chris Tobin, who's a Darug elder and Darug artist and practitioner, sit in on our kind of journeys. Because, I think first and foremost, it's really important to think about from what context you represent from and from what context you operate within, right? We are all in a sovereign relationship with sovereign territories, Aboriginal land, which was never ceded, sovereignty was never ceded. Whether or not you acknowledge it, you are in relationship to country, right? And it's, I think, an opportunity as PARI is quite young to really try and embed that at a structural and kind of personal level as well. So that's been really exciting. Kind of more broadly, I think, I don't know, I don't identify as an architect. I don't really identify as an artist too much either. I just love art. I love talking to people about art. And I think for the most part, a lot of the projects I like to work on is specifically that. It's about connecting with people. Hey, I think, Catherine, you kind of summed it up really beautifully in the projects that you sort of have been able to craft and facilitate discussions and connections with other disciplines and other people. I think that's, for me, it's a huge point of it. And so kind of being involved at PARI recently, which is an artist-run initiative started in Parramatta to support and represent Western Sydney and Western Sydney arts and culture. So I think it was built by artists and people working in Western Sydney, seeing what were the default trajectories and hierarchies that existed in Sydney, and being like, fuck that. How can we do things a bit differently or very differently? And so it's incredibly exciting. And I think that's probably where I'm going to cut the intro off.
Yeah, so great to be joined by you, Joel. And I feel like there's already really interesting through lines between, you know, what Catherine and yourself brought up, that it just seems like, I don't know, I just think art is such a social activity, even though we kind of a lot of the time focus on the shiny outcomes that we seem to consistently be on this hamster wheel producing, but it's actually the relationships and the talking and the friendships and the community that you're embedded around, whether they're artists or not, that really keep this whole art and culture thing going. It'd be great to throw over to you, Jamie, to give us a sense of where you're at with Next Wave, and as the one performing artist in the room. Yeah, if you want to give us a sense of your practice and Next Wave and sort of where you're at.
Right. Thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. It's interesting. I'm really good friends with Tian, Joel, so I feel like I was there in the early conversations about Pari and the imaginings of that, and it's really exciting to see how it's been growing. My name is Jamie Lewis, and I come from the little island nation of Singapore in the Malay archipelago, and so really also want to acknowledge being a guest on this continent, wearing many hats as an artist. Practitioner over the last 11 years of being here, and only in February this year started at Next Wave, and so from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nations, I, as well as Next Wave, is very privileged to traverse the land and waterways of this continent of many nations to share in the act of art making and culture building, grounded on justice, friendship, and care. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And you know, Joel, you brought that up, and I think, yeah, the positionality is a very important thing for me. I have a practice as a performance maker. I was trained in theatre and kind of moved into more immersive, interactive, participatory kind of forms. But also work as a dramaturg with other artists, and you know, dramaturgy for me often is really about context. So the primary practice, you know, really centers around the idea of context is everything, which I guess also has really informed my participatory kind of performances. A lot of my work is site responsive, so taking place, and place can be physical site or, you know, historical context, people, community, but yeah, site responsive work. And I also work a lot with food and conversation. So I cook and we eat, and I facilitate conversation and storytelling around the table. I guess, you know, more recently, a lot of my work has also shifted where I facilitate other people to make work. So often facilitating communities as artists, especially people who don't usually think of themselves as artists. And I guess across the board, a lot of my works, audiences are always there's participants, very active participants in the work. So that's my role, my work as an artist. And I guess coming into a role as CEO at Next Wave as well, it's a really interesting space. I think over the years, wearing multiple hats as an arts manager and, you know, to pay your rent and things like that, I've never really thought of them as different things. I've looked for ways in which there are many streams of similar practices. And I guess even as a performer, I perform as Jamie, and I often talked about my craft as facilitation. And so I think across the board, the idea is about facilitating conversation and storytelling, facilitating ways in which we can look at our positionality and look at the way we look at the world, and try and shift the way we look at the world each and every time we encounter each other. I guess is how I would really describe my kind of overall vision of what I do. Yeah, and so I guess, you know, I started the role at Next Wave in February this year, 11 years after being here on this continent as an artist. And so in a very auspicious way, as Andy mentioned, the organization started in 1985 when I was born, and you know, kind of wrapping up 10 years as an artist in Australia. I think, you know, kind of feeling a lot of that momentum and a lot of that yeah, coming into this space and really being able to own that as a, you know, youngish person and a woman of color. It's been really exciting in so many ways. but also to inherit an organization that is quite close to my heart as a young migrant. Back in 2012 was part of the festival with a collaborator, and who I still continue to collaborate with today in a long-term art marriage. And so, you know, the significance of the organization is really not lost on me when I think about my peers and colleagues who have continued to have careers and shows that still tour because they started out in that festival. And so, yeah, but I think as has been mentioned, you know, I came into an organization with a lot of the instincts of independent artists, and the way we've practiced and the way we build relationships and the way we transact with organizations. Having been a peer assessor, having been practicing, having, you know, an arts manager, and I guess my previous roles in arts management also was in a peak body for the performing arts. And so I have, I guess, quite a broad overview of how the arts operate, and a lot of my personal practice traverses the space of visual art and performance and public programming kind of context as well. So I guess, yeah, a lot of the things I've learned as a practitioner, I've come into an organization only to have some of those instincts confirm that we cannot continue to do the way, we cannot continue to do things the way it's been done, for practical reasons, but also I think for philosophical reasons. And, you know, having been based in Melbourne has been really rich culturally, but actually when I think back, a lot of my work's been actually in other places. And so often I'm challenged by the perception that Melbourne is the mecca of contemporary practice for experimental work, and it's not true. And so I think that was the one big thing I came into Next Wave and decided we need to shift this. It is not. So how do we put the magnifying glass on other places, especially regional and remote communities? You know, what does that mean? And so that's one. And then the other thing, I think a big thing was looking at the longevity of the organization and thinking about what does this mean to be 36 years old, and what have we accumulated in 36 years old, and it's cohort after cohort after cohort of artists. If we lost our funding tomorrow, we are so rich, we've got so much to share. And so for me, looking at how we really built in an intergenerational context, and own that context and start from there, was a big one. And so that's the two things that kind of really drove how I've been remodeling at that organization. And, you know, happy to talk more as the questions come up, but I think I might leave the introduction there too.
We might actually come back to you momentarily, Jamie, to ask a little bit more about that structural shift, because I feel like, you know, as someone who is based in Melbourne and was also a part of the Next Wave cohort in 2019 for the Next Wave Festival that never was, it is, you know, nationally such a significant organisation. I can see some Adelaide-based artists in the Zoom room who have also participated in Next Wave and have, you know, really incredible and significant practices that were really amplified by that festival. And it's obviously not a festival anymore. It has really shifted. You have brought so many philosophical changes to it, Jamie, that I think, in my experience anyway, you know, similarly inheriting this weird organization with a strange legacy at a time where everything just stopped working. All of a sudden, everyone is asking these really deep questions about, you know, well, what the hell are we meant to do now as artists, as independent artists? And I feel like, you know, my arts administrator nerd heart went aflutter when I read your new strategic plan, which obviously you don't need to go through point by point because it's maybe not, you know, that sexy to talk about in a Zoom. But I'd really love to hear the really deep questions that you brought to that organization as an artist, and what has driven this change, especially around ideas of working slower and relationships.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very a real compliment. To imagine that strategic plans could be sexy and fun to read is a real treat for me and a real affirmation. So really appreciate that. I think I think, I think this sentiment's probably shared. Like, when you think back on your last major project, right? How long did that really take to get up? From its seed idea, from the time you started seeding an idea to that time you decided, okay, I've got the stamina to start producing the work. And when in a performance context, especially when you decide you're going to produce the work, it's not the first day you're in the studio working creatively. When you decide you're ready to pursue this work, that first phase is actually mapping out, okay, what do I need? Which funding cycle are you going for? Which opportunity, what residency do you want to try and approach so you can have that first creative development period plotted out? Like that's the extent of like where you start from. And when you finish, like when you premiere the work, it's at least 2 years later, assuming everything goes as planned, assuming you get every funding cycle you ask for, or you broker that partnership on the first go and you get in. Otherwise, it's, I have a work sitting in the background still that I'm still chipping away, waiting for one final development that started back in 2018. It's not done yet. It's far from done. I haven't sold the work. I don't have a presenter for it. Like that's how long works actually take to make. So I think one big thing for me was why in a biennial festival model, how do you expect an early career practitioner to make your most ambitious work in 1.5 years and be ready to present it at a major festival? So that in itself was already this idea of like, let's not even talk about going slower. The fact is that's how long it takes. And so how do I then actually embed that structure of making? Because then also coming back to like, what is Next Wave, right? Festival or not, it's a platform. Next Wave doesn't make work. Next Wave is a container in which artists make work. So if that's how long artists take to make work, then we shift the container to enable actually that process to happen. So actually at the heart of it, that's for me, coming back to that was really the ambition in this context. And for me to come back to some of those like core rationale stuff. Of course, there's a lot of concurrent things. I mean, primarily also resource-wise, that it's a very different time. And if I really wanted to then go, okay, a work needs at least this amount of time and at least this amount of money, then actually we can't deliver a festival because that money is not going to artists, then the money is going to marketing and some of those kinds of really weighing up those realities and going, how do we reorientate this? I think also then going back to the idea of the counterpoint of decentralizing is reorienting, right? So for me, it was really about going, well, what are other people, what's the aesthetic, what's the power, whose knowledge, who else do we want to center and look towards? And so structurally, where we started from is then to have appoint an artistic directorate across the continent. And of course, also I want to say, states are a really blunt way of orientating location, but it is within the kind of funding structures that we work within. And so I went with that to start. And so we have an artistic directorate member across this continent, one in each state. And I think coming back to a lot of stuff, Catherine and Joel, you were saying about relationships, if we're going to engage nationally meaningfully, then I'm not going to sit in Melbourne and pretend I have all that intel and all that relationship and all that knowledge. I think over the years, I've accumulated a lot of that. I've collected surrogate family in my artistic friends and peers, but actually people who continue to live where they work and work where they live, they're the ones with the insight and the intelligence and the relationships and the network. So how do I build a structure in which we trust that and extend on that? And then and so that was the very first premise of doing that National Artistic Directorate, and from there the rest of it kind of played itself out. If we're going to then commission new work through Kickstart, which is a legacy program for 20 years, then now we're going to do that nationally with the support of this, this intergenerational relationship with an artistic director who's a bit more experienced and has accumulated those relationships. And so much of our practices is really about extending these relationships, right? A number of times with, my work, forget the making art part, the making work. So much of my work as an artist has been to introduce somebody to somebody else. So really just building on that premise. And so with Kickstart now, we are commissioning artists where they live and work. And when we say that, of course, the work isn't locked in to be there, but we're asking them to consider the context in which they start from. But this means you can actually more meaningfully sit with elders or with community or with place. And these things also mean consultation's not an afterthought. This is actually your starting point. So for me, also the fundamentals of making work becomes, it just makes sense, right? And all these things, I guess, again, the instincts have come from having struggled with some of those processes myself, or having tried to like embed some of that from my own practice. And now I'm going, okay, actually, how do I switch next wave structures in order to enable artists to do some of those things? And so, yeah, I guess, I mean, yeah, I can go into detail of every programming stream, but, I think that's the basis of the unpacking of the festival. And once you do that as well, then you're freed up to do a lot of many different things, because the festival is not your one container anymore. And so, we'll be announcing all those things as we go. So, stay tuned. But I think, yeah, at the heart of it, some of that comes back to those realities. Yeah.
Well, there's so many different threads to sort of pull out from there, but one that I kind of want to start with and sort of, maybe bring Catherine into the conversation a little bit more, is that you were talking about, the realities of how long it takes to get a project up and the structures of resources that you need to be a practicing professional artist, including funding resources, peers, infrastructure, relationships. And the reality is that we find ourselves within a situation where those resources don't exist in the same way as they have done in the past. There was the glory days of Next Wave that I remember under Emily Sexton, when it seemed like there was just cash sort of being like thrown everywhere. They were really well supported sort of projects. And I sort of came into Next Wave at a point where it felt like I was still trying to cling on to that level of ambition. But the reality is that there's actually just not the political appetite or the funding resources to actually be as ambitious as you'd like to be. But I recall in our previous conversation, Catherine, that you were saying you started the Grey Street workshop at a time when the South Australian government was trying to sort of really invest in sort of grassroots sort of activity.
What a utopia that was.
Yeah, what a utopia. And here you are sort of 36 years later. And I'm always blown away by people who have careers that are decades long, because I feel like a successful practice for me is one that I can have for at least 4 decades. But I just really want to sort of get a sense of, as things have gone up and down since the 80s, since all these different sorts of funding landscapes and resourcing landscapes and communities and ideas have shifted, how have you stayed in it? How are
we still breathing?
Yeah, how are you still breathing, running an ARI since 1985?
Look, the answer is really simple. It is the relationships between people. And yes, we've been through a lot of cycles. This is another cycle. But, as you know, artists have always been the first responders, we're always right there. We're the translators, the responders, the reflectors, and it's not something that I don't think you can go by that kind of thing. You are it, you're passionate right from the start about it. And unfortunately for us, that is always the case, because we will do it for nothing a lot of the time. We're good at that, aren't we? We know about that. As a group, though, you're facing a lot of different levels of experience and different levels of enthusiasm, usually when you come together in an artist-run initiative, the bond is that you want to be an artist, you want to practice as an artist. You might not know what that means, but that's what you want to do for your life. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to fund it? You know, and I can't say that it's changed a great deal over the 42 years of practice. I mean, we've had cycles of governments going, oh yeah, that's what an artist does. Well, they're valuable to culture. Yeah, we need culture. Let's throw them some money. And then they forget about us for a while. And then somebody, you know, sees some hand waving in the distance and they might throw you some more money. But the fact is that we're necessary to life. We're necessary to balance and imbalance, because we do translate what's happening in the world, you know, at the coalface of the world. It's not a late response, it's right absolutely on time. And unfortunately, this government that we have at the moment isn't au fait with the level of sophistication that this country has in the arts. I wish it were different, but it doesn't mean that we're going to fade away. But as a group, it's much easier to sustain yourself. It's much easier to share your passion. It's much easier to share equipment, to share the rent. The practical things of being an artist are fundamentally easier in a group. And look, I was so interested to hear Joel's version of, you know, you're having a visioning session, which is absolutely critical to being an artist, you know. So in Grey Street, we have mini summits. That's what we call them. Like we have meetings and stuff. We mentor each other. Once a week, everybody gets a turn. That person sets the criteria of how they want to be mentored, what kind of criticism they want, whether they want sounding boards. And this is the success of Grey Street, that we've been able to do that. In our summits, though, we have much broader vision about where we sit within the context of practice. So not only our individual practices, but locally, nationally and internationally. What do we do? Who are we? Why are we? Those are the fundamental questions that drive us. So we have a bigger picture of where we fit. We can set some goals. They can be collaborative or individual, but just taking special time to think about where you are now, where you've been, and where you want to go. It's critical to survival.
Oh, that's so lovely, Catherine. I think that's like so, yeah. I feel like it's strange that it was only under COVID that I made the decision that I was going to be an artist for the rest of my life. And so it's just like, yeah, you do kind of like go through these ebbs and flows, and no matter what it looks like, it's just always there. Kind of like an illness, but not really. You just can't switch it up. Yeah, an affliction. I'm sort of, want to hear a tiny bit more from Joel and then sort of open up to some more free-flowing questions between us all. But the thing that I'm interested in with you, Joel, in relation to this conversation is that, at least from my perspective as someone who works at Westbase, architects are actually a really important part of the ecology because they have money and they love collecting art. And so I'm just really interested into why, for you, contemporary art is a thing. What is it that it can do that architecture can't? What questions are you trying to think through in architecture that couldn't be answered in that sort of thing? And so why is it that you've landed at contemporary art, given the realities of the financial situation that one may find themselves in, of of the difficulties that maybe would have been subverted if you had continued being a practicing architect?
Yeah, like you can hear me, yeah. Still involved in, I think, kind of urban and spatial decision making, discourse at all times. I think practicing, even as, you know, like as a Wiradjuri man, mixed heritage, I know how I appear. I am already extremely overrepresented within architecture, right? And also within the arts. But I think in a literal material way, architecture represents resources explicitly. And buildings take time. They take time, decision-making processes around urban redevelopment and all these other things take a lot of time. So there's I think kind of how both kind of Jamie and Catherine have sort of spoken about the immediacy, the sort of first response kind of relationship that I think kind of arts practice and arts workers sort of have in relationship to those things. It was the urgency of the sets of conversations that I was trying to have in relationship to my own community, which was, you know, rapidly gentrifying in front of all of us, and how that kind of knock-on effects were kind of being felt in other places. And it also there's a real quality, especially, I mean, it's a funny balance to strike, but I feel like a lot of blackfellas could probably identify with this in lots of ways. So you're invited in with a certain sense of guilt from certain people in certain spaces, and you have to capitalize on that. Like, I'm sorry, but like it's a reality, and an arts program or an arts project can be experienced and can be understood at its surface value, which is often what the people inviting you in are engaging with, which can be problematic. But if you understand at what level you're engaging in your cultural currency, you can, you know, we all do it. It's how we navigate it. But some really amazing things can happen too. And that's always been the sort of the interesting capacity of this stuff. I still work in frameworks where I'm really interested in architecture, but I'm really not interested in building things. I'm interested in contracts. I'm interested in complicating land use agreements. I'm interested in title. Like today was our visioning session, and I was like, trajectory, my number one thing is like, let's talk about land. Like, it's land back, right? But that's much harder to do in the built environment decision-making processes that we currently have, right? But you can have a conversation about those things and potentially educate, change a space, like literally spatially change the dynamics within the space, within particular art projects and particular things that we do. For one example, Lorna Munro, who was my collaborator and co-host on the show that I worked on, Survival Guide, we put together a sort of community archive in Redfern. You know, there was no space for Indigenous people to even gather, right? And so we had to go up to 107 Projects, which is like a, you know, white run RE on Redfern Street, and hit them up being like, we want to use the space so that we can set up a community archive for a little bit, you know, super simple projects. They're like, of course. They gave us the space for free, you know, that's how you do it. And we set up scanners, and the whole project was just about scanning our nans photos, like just letting our aunties and our nans come in and just scanning those photos. And, you know, on surface level, it's this really simple thing from an arts organization's point of view and from anything on paper. But what it did in that space over 6 weeks, pinning up every one of those photos, and the resonance and the opportunity to talk, like to see things represented in that way, and the sort of the potency of that kind of as a set of conversations and relationships. You know, like people were bringing their toddlers in, and so they could see the story because the story is not out there anymore. But also people could come in and feel like safe because they had a space that felt like it represented them and was their own in some capacity, because literally their stuff was up on the walls. So there was like, there's an urgency and there's a rapid fire sort of nature to it. But I think those projects also help us think creatively about how we solve particular problems. after organizing in my own community a lot where space is at a premium, I mean, that was my conditions for joining PARI. I was like, I want free reign on the space. Like, I want to be able to use the space. Like, no one in my community, my cousins, my friends, we don't have space, like, because it's too expensive in Redfern. Like, we need to find something. You know, helps you think really logistically and really interestingly about, you know, really kind of basic stuff like safety and access and security, and, you know, these things that, like, you know, get written down on a piece of paper in an institution as like a framework of how to do things, but like that doesn't work like for everybody, right? Like, it doesn't reflect everyone's values, doesn't reflect everyone's sort of safety and security. So like, yeah, I'm sort of talking vaguely, but specifically in that instance, it was, you know, after being unable to have access to space in Redfern for so long, and then going into a white space to operate it, we knew that we had to provide a safety, essentially just like safety protocols for the police, because average, you know, like there weren't many spaces for black fellas to gather, and they weren't going to gather unless they knew that they weren't going to be fucking harassed by the cops, right? And that kind of comes from projects that we do, and I think that that's really important. So I think it all loops back into the spatial stuff, and it loops back into decision-making processes around built environment and stuff. I think it's true. I think, you know, that privilege, you know, architecture reflecting resources is the reality. That's why they are the people who can buy the work. But that is also a very, you know, that's a very privileged minority. And that's the other thing. I don't connect with those people in the way that I connect with the people that I see reflecting my experiences similar to me in arts communities. And yeah, so in a kind of professional capacity in architecture, I don't think I need to take up that space as much as I want to support opportunities for other people to take up that space. So in PARI now, we're sort of trying to develop sort of a much more kind of pedagogical framework and knowledge production for these specific things, and kind of hopefully developing some teaching models and some different things that are sort of centered around diagonal relationships to space, and then we can talk about that with artists and people going into the future. So it's, yeah, it's a big part of it, but I don't know, I feel like I'm trailing off now. Yeah.
That was really amazing. I'm just so aware that all of us are artists, and so few of us in this conversation so far have actually talked about the sort of art that we directly make, which is actually really interesting.
I was going to say today in the visioning, we were like talking about PARI and its exhibitions, and we were like, the exhibitions are really incidental, hey? Like,
and it seems like what's coming from this conversation from all of it, from what I've heard, is that the practice of making art is so far removed from just this idea of this constant production of particular, you know, individual works for exhibition in a gallery, for collection by an institution. It, you know, takes so many different forms. There's a question that's come through from Emma, from MFA, thinking about the role that local communities, local artistic and cultural communities can play being enablers of a new vision. And obviously we're at a time where a lot of these different sort of localities are in need of some new vision, because it seems like everything's really broken. So it's just, I'd love to throw it open to all of you. Like, what are the sort of visions that you feel like are coming out of artists and cultural workers that are really needed right now, and sort of what are the deep sort of questions that people are asking, or how is it that we're going about sort of working locally to build a new vision for art, for culture, for relationships and artistic communities?
I might just start with, because this is really fresh, we were talking about this today at PARI, like, I think a really key aspect of that is like transparency. You know, like arts organizations, at least in Sydney, and I know in most of the other places, like the conditions in which your labor is kind of engaged with, even in like other volunteer like organizations like in Sydney, I think more than anywhere, it has this like turbo place where there's like these places that are sort of optically identified as like artist run orgs, but they're like in and of themselves are institutions and they operate in a very particular way. and it's not particularly transparent about what's expected of you and how you can cooperate and how you should engage in those things. And so like one of the large parts of what we're trying to do with PARI is like have absolutely everything accessible from anyone who wants to engage us. So in terms of like the budgets into our programs, our structure, our website, the source code is open to you, like having everything as a resource to model from, because I mean, that's the point I'm trying to get to, is it's a model. Like PARI isn't the room, and it's kind of not even all of the people all the time, because that is always going to change. It's a model, right? And, you know, this is me kind of regurgitating what has been like 3 years of development from people like Tian and Cal and Justine Youssef and Akil Ahmed, and, you know, all of these amazing people that I really want to honor because they set the groundwork for something that I got to be involved with and now get to sort of weigh in on in some capacity. So I think transparency is really key in like in a really clear way, because we want, how else can we expect? I don't know, it's, you know, you can be capo dog about it and be like, look, we're the best at something, so therefore we get all the work, right? Or you get all the things and that's how you change things competitively, right? And like, that's, I think that there's the space for that in other things. But for us, like, we want to have everything open so that people can come to us and ask questions and be like, oh, how do you guys do that? And how does this run? And how does this happen? And be like, yeah, it's just on the website where you can come in and talk to us and it's really chill. Like, so transparency is a big one.
Yeah, it's kind of like a metaphor for being an artist, actually. I think transparency is really important as an organisation, but as an individual who creates outcomes that, you know, I think the outcomes are kind of just the tip of the iceberg. We all strive for outcomes, and when you're applying for funding, that's what you have to spruik the most, you know, how wonderful and how expansive is your outcome. In actual fact, I think the processes of thinking and in fact talking about the actual processes gives people a lot of insight into how the organisation ticks, how vital it is, how human it is, how humane it is. And I, as an artist, I strive to do that all the time. In fact, I think I keep on saying that the process is my artwork. You know, that's the outcome. That's sometimes more important and rich and challenging to communicate than the outcome. Some people only want magic tricks, like organisations that will fix things and be perfect, but they can't be. We can't be, because we're not perfect beings. And I think that's a myth. And so I think showing our processes, talking them through, being transparent, as you say, Joel, is critical. And it's what I'm getting from you, Jamie, too. Your thinking, your personal experience is flavouring the pathways that you're following now, and I find that really interesting.
I think that as a performance artist, there's a magic in liveness, and I think liveness is a really interesting thing in conversation in this context, in response to the questions of process, and because especially in the kind of participatory forms that I work in. That liveness is constantly, that's the contested territory. You know, you're inviting audiences as participants that will affect the very moment to moment kind of thing that happens, and the way the rest of the work plays out, while at the same time holding on to the frame of the work you've created. And so to me, I guess, you know, that there's a reason why I ended up making that kind of work, I think, because I feel like it is philosophically in my nature. And a lot of my storytelling is autobiographical as well. So I think, you know, when we talk about transparency, it's a really interesting thing where, yeah, like being able to talk about very vulnerable things, or your failures, or your, you know, your process, that you know, and as makers, right, when you start making work, you have a hunch. You have a hunch of what it might be, but you have a practice, so you have a process that you know. But you also know that so much can change, and you're willing to move with it. And as you go closer to the hunch, you might end up making something totally different. But each time, you know, you readjust that hunch as you go, and it's that, to be transparent about that part. But transparency is an interesting thing, Joel, because I think then from the perspective of then an organization, like personally, I have no problem with that. Now, how do I engender that in an organization? And I suppose, you know, so one of the things we're doing at Next Wave is to remove the idea of an EOI and the expression of interest and applications and that kind of, and for me, that reason's to do with labor, but also totally appreciate that there are many spaces that require that as a function. And then especially, like, you know, we have a very close relationship working with Moreland City Council, and, you know, when you look at local governments and those kinds of spaces, they really have to have such structures in place to process information and people and money. But as a small to medium arts organization, then for me, a lot of that thinking, like, okay, how do I engender that relationality in how we curate and meet artists? But at the same time, that's a process that often will get criticized for being not transparent, because the idea of you curate people you know. But then I suppose, again, in coming into this space with that personal practice is to then go, well, how do we always challenge ourselves to go, who else is not here? You know, which I think in a place-based kind of way, that's you know, usually in my set of questions when I come to a new site or a new context when I'm making work, is to map who's here and then map who's not here, right? Whose stories are here and whose stories are not here. So it's interesting I think for me, trying to transpose this practice into the organization with the rest of my staff, because I know how to do this. Now, how do I get my creative producers to understand this tacitly as well, not just going, oh, this is Jamie's strategy or the vision, but tacitly they grow into that practice as well. And that being the transparent, what's transparent. Am I making sense? Yeah.
Totally. It's interesting. I think we talk about this a lot, and I've thought about this a lot more broadly before getting super involved. It's like what are you trying to instill? And what is relational? So what is actually built up from the relationships of what comes in, and when does something become, you know, like a practice and a protocol that is translatable and movable, and people can sort of have a checklist or whatever they want to do, and how much of it is embodied and relationship based, and how do we kind of, and we're a kind of, especially in PARI, but I have done this with lots of other organizations as well. It's like, how do you navigate these places, these two things, right? When, because we can't perfect future tense, we're all still doing the things that we love, but, you know, that's not always going to happen. And how do you navigate to kind of not foolproof, but create some sort of legacy or something that is passed on, or is that necessary? I think is another interesting question. I think we're seeing organizations in a particular arts environment, an ecosystem at the moment, who are not servicing maybe the people that they describe that they do, and they are going in directions which I think is well deserved, because they don't represent the things that they attest to, right? and like, that's the process, right? Like, it's change, like things are changing, and the places that do represent, I think, are kind of at the moment at least getting a little bit of attention, and I think that that's an interesting sort of movement. But yeah, I think it's a tension for me about how, well, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to foster a space that just allows for relationships to be formed, and that is the most key and important thing? Or is there actually like, oh no, this is proven, this is an important value that we want to sort of translate and continue to for many people or generations or whatever to sort of take forward, if we're going to talk about utopia in the future, right?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up transparency, Joel. There's, been a bit of back and forth in the chat, and I feel like for me, as someone who came to art really late, sort of grew up into my sort of early to mid 20s, not even kind of realizing what art was, growing up in Kalgoorlie, like the art world is purposefully opaque, and West Space in its legacy that has this huge reputation, I think, has a history of being incredibly opaque and exclusive. But I think that transparency is actually comes from hopefully this belief where it's like art's for everybody. And that transparency is trying to transmit this like capacity and toolkit for people where it's like, yeah, it's not magic, it's not smoke and mirrors, it's just like this hustle with your friends and trying to like get the stuff up to build a space for the community around you. And it can look so many different ways. And some places, through a sleight of hand, seemingly are able to sort of climb the rungs and look like they're really shiny and really big. But I guess in terms of transparency's sake, I was really shocked to come into this acting director role and realize that West Space had been functioning this particular way off like, less than what Tony Elwood earns a year, but trying to like exist in the same space and function in this economic model that actually just doesn't function and doesn't exist. It's not real.
I think another point for transparency, which kind of also bogs down into like a bit of bureaucratical nightmares, is like we create data, right? Like we create information about the ways that we struggle to survive. Like that should be public. Like that should be accessible. That should inform, hopefully, policy decisions down the track when we think about different scale communities and new visions, right? So like that's the labor, like, because we care, right? And holding is an act of care. And we hold on to this stuff because we care about the communities we exist in. We care about the work that our friends make and the things that we want to connect to. And so how do you like kind of take that step further and hold on to some of this stuff, which sometimes can be hard. So it's not easy to hold on to these things, but it's also like, it's important because these numbers, I mean, they tell a story, and they can tell a story about how hard it is to actually survive, like, and maintain like what you just mentioned, Andy, the fact that was completely opaque is like so strange, like in a way, right? Like it seems antagonistic to being like finding any help or getting anything, like seeing anything change. But
yeah, I guess to sort of take the conversation, because I'm sort of aware of the time, to take the conversation in a direction where we can maybe move towards a lot of optimism and hope and thinking about where to move into in the future. I do a lot of professional development stuff at art schools, and I think people are for graduate students and undergraduate, people even doing their masters. And I think people are really shocked that it's like, no, I never studied art. I didn't do any of this, but this is sort of how I did it. And this is kind of like the steps that I followed to kind of eke together a living and a community and a life in art, even though like 5 years ago, I didn't even know it was possible. What do you think that this sort of early generation that's coming up through now, that it's so sad that we're actually at like risk of losing? Thinking about those artists that are coming up now as all of these resources are going, as sort of disappearing. What knowledge do you think emerging artists need now, and what support and what resources do they need to sort of flourish?
That's where I say a group model works perfectly, but I want to end on a positive note. We need to be aware that there's a little bit of a gap here, between what's happening with education. What's feeding our culture? That's the question. What's feeding our culture? How can we plug that gap that's about to emerge even in a broader sense? Because there's, where are the artists coming from? Where are the seeds, There's still some incredible passion around, and And that's what's going to carry us through. Communication, humanitarianism, the fact that we've had time, an incredible time in the last 2 years to reflect more on these things of what's important. That's what's going to carry us through. That's what's going to encourage young artists to be artists. Those that realise that, you know, we have to care beyond ourselves about the world we live in and achieve some kind of balance. And we're capable of expressing that. Young people in particular give me great hope. You know, they're leading these climate change marches. That's a wonderful, wonderful thing to think about. We need a lot of strength and we need a lot of cohesion for that to happen. And I think the voices that have been coming through today's symposium have been incredibly powerful, incredibly inclusive, and shown a lot of humanity. So today's given me a lot of hope. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of it.
I'm not concerned about the same thing, Andy. I reckon people will continue to make art regardless. And I think also more and more, you know, I won't speak on their behalf, but I am surprised, and I'm aware of this, that young people are already working differently. It's just that we're not working it with them, so we don't know, but they are, you know. I don't think they're concerned by some of that stuff. I think what I concern myself with is to continue that relationship stuff, because that's the one thing I can give, and then actually trust that people will still make art, like as with, you know, Catherine's story. You know, like, I just think people have always come together. People have always, you know, the ideas are the easy part, right? Sit around for another hour and we'll come up with new projects, like easy. Finishing them is the other thing, right? So, and that comes with, yes, those kinds of tangible skills that you will learn anyway. But yeah, I think hence the role of relationships and the role of us as that intergenerational like exchange, that I have something to learn from these young people too. So I'm not concerned about what they will need to make art happen. They will make art happen. I think for us then is just to constantly nudge at the structures and the beams and the scaffolds, you know, in a soft and gentle way, so that it becomes easy for people to push through them. I think the thing I also want to say, you know, before, there are stories within the story, you know, so the narrative that, you know, Joel and Andy was talking about, like, but there's narratives within those narratives as well. So again, if we constantly reference that arc of that storyline, as you said, Andy, that we operate within organizations that you know, are less than 20-hour salary, but at the same time, then within our financial story, what's the story I want to tell then? You know, and so, you know, one of the financial narratives in Next Wave that this model have allowed us to shift is suddenly now, in dollar value, I'm paying artists on par as I'm paying staff, and in an organizational budget. And with staff, you know, I have less staff, but they're on benchmark salaries where they're better taken care of and not burn out. Like, that's a story, and I can hold on to that story. That's a win. That's a win for me as the incoming CEO. That's a win, but that's a win for the sector as well. And that's a story I'd rather talk about, rather than the idea that I'm not earning as much as, or, you know, my organization and the NGV. Like, that's not, again, who do we want to orientate towards as the center of the narrative? That it's not them, you know? And so I think, again, the craft of a storyteller coming in to run an organization is I get to write the stories now. And I'm gonna, yeah, which for me also ties into that sense of time that, you know, talking about wanting to be an artist for the rest of my life, you know, that's something I've thought a lot as well. And I think that's the point, right? That I want to do this for the rest of my life. If we talk about dramaturgy and rhythm and pace, then what's that structure over time? What's my story arc over time? It's not a career peak or a high, is an ebb and a flow and a lull and a change. And yeah, I can, you know, like Joel, you can be an architect and then leave and then come back and go somewhere else. Like all those paths are possible. And I think those kinds of narratives are the ones, if anything, then young people and emerging artists need to know. There is no, you know, none of it is linear, nor should it be. None of it is binary, nor should it be. And, you know, you don't have to make it at 40 to make it as an artist. The real mark is at 80. Somebody still wants me to dramaturg their work. You know, that's my goal. And, but yeah, I think, you know, that slowing down that we started with this conversation for me is about this long game, not fast game. You know, that's my Asian auntie wisdom for all of you. They're a long game, not fast game. And those stories within those bigger stories, you know, they're just as important.
Do you have anything to add, Joel, before I wrap up?
I think, yeah, there was something that Jamie just said that really kind of resonated in this idea of telling the stories within stories. And I think like who's in the story, or maybe a different way is like how you're thinking about that narrative is like when it's like, you know, exactly who you're measuring yourself by and by what standards you are measuring the things that you're trying to achieve. And I had a nice conversation the other day where it's like, you know, the fact that like larger organizations don't know what the hell I or what I continue to do within either like Future Method or within PARI is a good sign. Like, because I don't like how the system operates. And if you're sort of pushing in a direction that feels like it can't really be defined within the narrow frameworks that we have been, unfortunately, kind of had to like rigidly pushed into to survive and exist, then that's, you know, maybe making it a little bit more viable for someone in the future and helping sort of eke out those pathways in a nice direction. I think it's all about relationships. Like we've said this so many times, it's just that. It's just like, it's, and being earnest, I don't know, like, it's just, everyone, like.
Being honest is so underrated.
Like,
it's so important.
It's just like, it's just the coolest thing. Like, it's just like, it's actually like, I don't know, yeah, I think it's actually just the sweetest thing to be surrounded by people who really, really are earnest and clear about what they want. And I feel like I felt that today when I was in this meeting and now in this session with you all. Like, I think that's what I find compelling and really cool about connecting with people, is that when people are really honest and really clear about the fact that, like, yeah, things are shit, but also things can be really great. And we're doing this because we love it, right? And that's, I mean, we love the relationships. The work we don't do because we love, because we're not going to get exploited. I don't want those things to sort of like fold over into each other. I think do what you love narratives are pretty fucked up. But I think what we do love is connecting and forming these relationships. And I think that's really clear from this talk. And I just, yeah, it's just such a privilege to connect with you all.
Yeah, thank you all so much. It's great that it's a Saturday afternoon panel and I feel really invigorated as opposed to sort of emotionally like, yeah. So thank you all so much. It's such a pleasure being able to sort of chat and nerd out with people who I really respect, and to have such a fantastic audience. Thank you so much for your comments in the chat as that rolled out. And I hope you had a lovely day of panels and discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andy and Catherine and Jamie and Joel. It's fantastic to hear from you all. And thank you everyone for all of your questions. It's been really incredible. I actually just wanted to ask a question myself, if that's okay, which is slightly off topic, but I think really comes back in terms of thinking about time and the long game, as you were talking about, Jamie. And Joel, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the current edition of Runway. The thematic is time. And I just feel like there's so many stories within that you could probably cherry pick a little, because I'm sure that there's a lot about relationship building and collaboration within that. And I'm just wondering perhaps if we could even close the session on you telling us a little bit about the edition.
I know, especially when Jamie was talking about time, I just wanted to weigh in and be like, no linear fucking time. Yeah. I guess this is probably in the editorial essay as well, but it feels like it's been the reminder that I've been able to say kind of pretty consistently. But like time as a thematic was really fun, because like, yeah, at surface value, it's pretty boring. And then you think about it for a second and it gets really fuzzy and you're like, oh, how good is that? And to see people respond to that is really generative, because I think it does what the prompt was made to do, which is kind of back to this idea of what I would say is the kind of core to any sort of like abolitionist or decolonial sort of framework, right? Which is about holding space for as many definitions and as many possibilities as possible. And so when you push past the surface idea of like how time might operate in the way that it's, structures our kind of capitalist society that we all exist in, it becomes really clear how we're all subjectively and physically and emotionally and spiritually in different times. And that as a base point, as a place to share and to realize all of that really like interesting detail, maybe minutiae is what you could call it, and the opportunities to find shared objects of value in that is what's really compelling. And so that was always the sort of that was the goal. And I'm just really excited to support all of the artists that got to be involved. I mean, it's really fun to spend other people's money on commissioning art. Like, it's just like the best thing. So that was really great. And it went live yesterday. So if you guys want to check it out, it's all there. There's some really amazing work. It was a lot of first times for a lot of artists as well, which I thought was really incredible. Like, not first times in their practice, but first videos, first essays, first, and I think that that's also a really amazing thing to try and support, right? Is like pushing people into, or inviting them to push into other spaces, so they don't just get put in these like narrow pathways of like, I'm a video artist who does this one thing, right? Like, if you're passionate about it, sure, but I think it's about supporting, holding as many opportunities as possible. So yeah, that was the frame. But again, no linear fucking time.
Thank you so much. I think that's such a generous way to end this session, and also the entire day. It's been such a beautiful day with so many, I feel very special right now. It's been a lovely bunch of conversations and so much enthusiasm and honesty and respect from everyone. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand over to Emma Fay, our CEO, who's going to give us some lovely closing remarks, and then hand us over to Bake Fridge, who are going to give us a little closing party that we can join in on. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. I feel like my heart's a flutter, actually. I think this sort of the way that conversation kind of closed off talking about time, one of my favorite subject matters at the moment, and also earnestness. And I feel like I've thought a lot about earnestness recently, and thank you. I really just wanted to acknowledge how valuable it is to shift the focus back to artistic and creative process and practice. And I feel like that's what today has all been about, as we sort of re-centered the conversation. And too much of what we talk about in our industry, but also widely, is very rarely focused on that artistic process and artistic practice. And I've really enjoyed that today. It's really filled me up. And there's just been this beautiful conversation about the way that we work as practitioners, the way that we build community in that way of working together, and the momentum that has actually emerged in this last crazy couple of years. I find it really invigorating. So thank you all. I want to thank every single one of our incredible panelists and facilitators. And I particularly also want to thank our incredible team at Guildhouse, particularly I'm looking at you, Debbie Pryor and Polly Diamond, for all of your epic work in the way that you've thoughtfully thought about bringing this panels together, and the way that our community loves to engage with these conversations, both here in the moment and after the fact. And so I just want to say thank you to everybody for participating. Thank you for being here, and let's have a little dance off.